She stood at the edge of the crowd, the early morning breeze tugging gently at her plain white tee. Rachel looked like anyone else, just another face lost in the rhythm of the city. But beneath those modest jeans lived a woman carrying more than just dreams. She held power, vision, and a real story waiting to unfold. People passed her by without a glance, unaware of the emotional story about to erupt inside Wakefield Dynamics. Sometimes the loudest storms begin in the quietest corners. A group of polished executives walked past her, their laughter sharp and careless.
Hello, I'm going to tell you this incredible story. Remember that to receive new stories like this, you can subscribe to the channel, like the video, and activate the notification bell. Without further ado, let's get to the rest of the story.
Probably lost, one whispered, not even bothering to lower his voice. Rachel offered a smile, meek on the surface, but forged in fire deep down. She wasn't angry. No, she was observing, letting this touching story of arrogance play out before making her move. You could say she blended in too well, on purpose. That morning wasn't just a stroll, it was a test. Like a silent observer in her own experiment, Rachel was watching how people treated someone they believed couldn't offer them anything. That moment alone peeled back layers of culture within the company. Behind their crisp suits and rehearsed charm, Rachel saw the rot, exactly what her boyfriend feared when he handed her the reins. No one knew she had the keys to the kingdom. She didn't need grand entrances or velvet ropes. What she needed was truth, raw and unfiltered. And truth, she learned, doesn't wear designer shoes. It stands awkwardly outside glass doors, listening, documenting, remembering. In that moment, an emotional story began to crystallize, one that had less to do with boardrooms and more to do with what people do when they think no one's watching. This wasn't her first time being underestimated. Rachel had built her life on being mistaken for less smart, less capable, less valuable. But every sneer outside that building fueled her resolve. She didn't just see the cracks in the system, she felt them. And that's what made her different. This touching story wasn't about revenge, it was about revelation. The irony? Those men she overheard were about to sit in a meeting led by the very woman they disrespected. A woman whose love story wasn't just tender, but transformative. Rachel wasn't only bringing her heart into that building, she was bringing change. And while they measured power by looks, she carried hers in silence. They had no idea the emotional story they had just written themselves into. Sometimes, the most powerful players don't announce themselves. They arrive in silence, wait in doorways, and take notes. That's how Rachel stepped into the company that morning. Not as a figurehead, but as a force. And though the laughter outside stung briefly, it set the stage for something much bigger. After all, change doesn't knock. It walks in quietly and listens first. Their story began far from boardrooms and stock charts. Rachel met him not as a billionaire, but as a man searching for something deeper, someone who saw through the gold-plated layers of his world. What sparked between them wasn't just chemistry, it was conviction. They talked for hours about justice, leadership, and what it meant to really change something from within. That emotional story blossomed, not in luxury, but in truth. He had built empires, but none of it felt right anymore. Money couldn't fix a broken culture, and Rachel, grounded, sharp, and honest, had a way of seeing things that others ignored. She didn't just challenge him, she made him better. Their touching story wasn't a fairy tale. It was a partnership forged in clarity, and it gave him the courage to act. When he appointed Rachel as CEO, it wasn't about love, it was about trust. He knew she could see what others refused to. But Rachel had a condition. She wanted to see the company with clear eyes, unfiltered by her title or relationship. So they kept the real story private, even from the board. She needed to walk through those halls as just Rachel to feel the truth beneath the polish. They didn't plan it for drama, they planned it for insight. Because real change isn't built on press releases or strategic hires. It's built on understanding what's really broken. Rachel wanted to meet the people, feel the pulse of the workplace, and observe the habits that form the culture. She didn't want admiration, she wanted honesty. And that, ironically, meant hiding who she really was. And what she saw confirmed everything they feared. Wakefield wasn't just inefficient, it was elitist. The same people talking about innovation were clinging to outdated power games. Rachel began documenting it all, quietly, not with vengeance, but with purpose. The emotional story she and her partner believed in was now intersecting with cold, corporate reality. And something had to give. This wasn't just about boardroom politics anymore. It was personal. Not because of pride, but because of values. Rachel had lived a life where people assumed her worth based on what she wore or who she loved. Now she was watching an entire company do the same. The touching stories of overlooked employees, the whispers of discrimination, it all echoed something familiar. And it had to be addressed from the top down. Her love wasn't just a comfort, it was a compass. Together, they had mapped out a plan not only to clean up a business, but to redefine what leadership could look like. And Rachel wasn't waiting for a perfect moment. She was building it, brick by brick. And behind every quiet step, there was a storm growing, one that would soon expose what power really looks like. That moment outside the building wasn't random. It was a mirror held up to the soul of Wakefield dynamics. Rachel didn't need spreadsheets or presentations to understand a company. Those few seconds of mockery told her everything. The emotional story unfolding before her eyes was painful, yet crucial. Sometimes, you learn more from a smirk than from a board report. The man who laughed the loudest had a senior role. His tone, dripping with arrogance, reflected a hierarchy built not on merit, but image. Rachel didn't flinch, but her silence was a decision. That single encounter wasn't an isolated case. It was the tip of something much darker. What seemed like a passing moment became a doorway into touching stories of injustice. Rachel quietly requested access to internal records. What she found wasn't surprising, but it was heartbreaking. Former employees had filed complaints that went nowhere. Women overlooked. People of color passed over. Talented voices silenced. These weren't rumors. They were real story fragments buried beneath corporate noise. She knew what had to be done. It wasn't just about firing a few bad apples. The problem was systemic, baked into the foundation. Meetings held in echo chambers. Promotions handed out over drinks. A culture where the loudest always won. Rachel had seen it before, in other companies and stories whispered at conferences. But now it was in her hands. And this time, she could do something. She remembered a janitor she passed on her first day. Eyes tired, posture heavy. He smiled at her like she mattered. Later, she learned he had been working there for 10 years without a raise. His emotional story echoed what she saw in the data. Those at the bottom carried the weight, while those at the top collected praise. And no one seemed to care. Rachel started documenting everything. Not out of revenge, but justice. She wasn't going to barge in and make noise. She was going to show the truth, one undeniable piece at a time. Because real change isn't loud, it's deliberate. The touching stories of resilience she uncovered gave her fuel. And she knew that when the time came, the reveal had to be unforgettable. Behind every exposed truth, there was a name, a face, a life that had been dimmed by someone else's ego. Rachel carried them all in her heart. She wasn't just preparing for a leadership role, she was preparing for a reckoning. And deep down, she knew. The louder the silence now, the more powerful the impact would be when the truth came to light. The next morning, Rachel didn't arrive as the woman from the sidewalk. She stepped into the building in an elegant white suit, her presence commanding but calm. Conversations faded mid-sentence. Eyes turned. There was something different now, an energy that couldn't be ignored. The emotional story that had begun in silence was about to echo through every corridor of Wakefield dynamics. Executives who had once mocked her were now scrambling, whispering, straightening their ties. The room she entered wasn't ready for what was coming. Her boyfriend, poised beside her, introduced her not as a visitor, but as the new CEO. You could feel the oxygen leave the room. The real story they thought they knew had just been rewritten, live, in real time. Rachel didn't speak right away. Instead, she played a short clip, the security footage from outside the building. Gasps, shifts in seats, uneasy coughs. There they were, on screen, mocking the woman now standing before them with poise. The same voices that laughed yesterday were trembling today. It was more than a reveal. It was a mirror turned on the powerful. She looked them in the eye, not with rage, but with resolve. "This is what we've built," she said, her voice steady. "A culture where judgment comes before understanding." You could hear a pin drop. Her emotional story wasn't about vengeance. It was a wake-up call. She wasn't here to punish. She was here to rebuild. But not everyone would be part of that journey. Some in the room paled as she continued, detailing the patterns she had uncovered. Discrimination, elitism, missed potential. She didn't need to raise her voice. The truth did the talking. And behind every example she gave, there was a name, a moment, a touching story that had been ignored for too long. The weight of accountability hung heavy in the air. Her message was simple, but it struck like lightning. Change was non-negotiable. If we want to be a company of the future, she said, we have to start by honoring people in the present. Not everyone clapped. Not everyone could. But a few did, quietly, gratefully. And that's when Rachel knew. The tide was already turning. The real story was shifting course. This wasn't just a leadership handoff. It was a cultural reckoning. The very people who thought they ran the place were now being asked to look in the mirror. And Rachel, the woman they once overlooked, had become the face of a new future. But the hardest part wasn't over. It was only beginning. Rachel didn't walk in her new role with fanfare. She walked in with purpose. Her first act as CEO wasn't a speech or a photo shoot. It was a one-on-one with a janitor who had smiled at her that first day. "We're starting from the ground up," she said, and she meant it. The emotional story of Wakefield was shifting, no longer centered around the elite few. It was time to make room for the people who had always been there, unseen. She launched an internal audit, not to punish, but to understand. Who was being left out? Who was being overlooked? And more importantly, why? Rachel began crafting policies that honored performance over politics, heart over hierarchy. The touching stories of quiet, hardworking employees became her compass. Every reform was a tribute to their resilience. Workshops replaced power lunches. Mentorship replaced micromanagement. Executives were asked to re-earn their seats, not just keep them. Some left. Others adapted. But what mattered most was that the tone had changed. Wakefield Dynamics was no longer run by whispers and gatekeeping. It was built on inclusion. And for the first time, people believed their voice mattered. Rachel wasn't interested in being the face of a diversity campaign. She was interested in real results. Promotions began to reflect potential, not politics. Ideas were welcomed from every level of the company. She personally mentored new hires, reminding them that leadership had nothing to do with where you came from and everything to do with where you're willing to go. That's how she honored the emotional story behind every success. Her relationship with the founder remained in the background, intentionally. She wanted her impact to speak louder than her last name. But those who paid attention could feel something deeper guiding her decisions. A love story that had evolved into a mission. A real story written not in public gestures, but private integrity. That was her superpower. The changes didn't make headlines overnight. But inside those walls, something real was happening. Employees began sharing stories of being heard, of being seen, of finally being valued. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And that's what made it powerful. Rachel wasn't promising utopia. She was delivering progress, one human moment at a time. And while others still judged leadership by status or style, Rachel redefined it daily, with courage, with love, and with results. Wakefield Dynamics had become more than a company. It was now a movement. And at the heart of it all stood a woman once laughed at on the sidewalk, now guiding an entire organization with quiet force. But there's more to tell. What would you have done in Rachel's place? Would you have stayed quiet or stood up like she did, even after being humiliated? And how many times have you been judged by how you look, not who you are? This real story isn't just about a company. It's about all of us and the world we're helping to shape. If this emotional story touched you, if you believe in true leadership and second chances, then let your voice be heard. Drop a comment below. Tell us what part hit you the hardest. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter in these powerful, touching stories that deserve to be told.